The moment those words slipped from his mouth, something inside me shattered. Not loudly, not with tears or screams, but quietly, like glass breaking underwater. "That fat woman disgusts me." He said it so casually, almost laughing, not realizing or maybe not caring that the fat woman he was talking about was me. I remember standing there in the kitchen, my hands trembling over a plate of pasta I had made for him. The television was on in the background, some fashion commercial playing, showing those tall, slender women smiling as they twirled in perfect dresses. He smirked at the screen, then turned toward me with that same cruel grin. "You see, that's what a real woman looks like, not someone who's let herself go." I froze. My throat burned, but no words came out. I just smiled faintly, pretending I hadn't heard, pretending I was busy washing the dishes, pretending I wasn't the woman he was mocking in his own home. That night, he went to bed without saying goodnight. I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling. My mind was racing, not just with his words, but with every time he'd made me feel small, every time I'd apologized for things that weren't my fault, every time I'd laughed off an insult just to keep the peace. The next morning, I woke up before him. I looked at his face as he slept, so peaceful, like he hadn't just torn me apart the night before. I didn't feel anger. I felt empty. And in that emptiness, a strange kind of clarity began to form. I got out of bed, stood in front of the mirror and really looked at myself. My reflection was tired, puffy eyes, soft curves, stretch marks. But for the first time in a long while, I didn't look away. I whispered to myself, "You don't disgust anyone. You've just forgotten how to love yourself." That day, something changed. Not dramatically, not like in movies where the woman suddenly packs her bags and drives off into the sunset. No, I just started with small things. I made breakfast for myself, not him. I took a walk outside, even though I felt awkward in my own skin. I smiled at a neighbor who'd always waved, but I'd been too self-conscious to greet. Later that evening, he came home and looked confused. "Where's dinner?" he asked, tossing his jacket on the chair. "I didn't make any," I said simply. He frowned. "You always make dinner." "Well," I said, "I guess that fat woman decided to take the night off." He didn't laugh. His face turned red, but for once, I didn't feel afraid of his anger. I just turned away and walked into the bedroom, my heart pounding, not from fear but from something else, strength. That night, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the streetlights flicker. For years I'd been living like a shadow in my own life. Quiet, obedient, invisible. But his cruelty had done something unexpected. It woke me up, and I realized something. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most end up being the ones who teach you how to finally love yourself. The next few weeks were like walking through fog, confusing, heavy, but with a strange light slowly breaking through. I still shared a house with him, but it didn't feel like home anymore. Every sound, every look, every silence between us had changed. He noticed it too. The way I stopped asking him what he wanted for dinner. The way I stopped waiting for his approval before buying something for myself. The way I started laughing, really laughing again, even if it wasn't with him. One evening, he finally said it. "You've changed." I looked up from my book and smiled softly. "Maybe I'm just remembering who I was before you made me forget." He didn't like that. He scoffed, muttered something under his breath, and walked away. But inside, I felt something powerful, like a quiet storm rising. For years I had been bending myself into someone he could tolerate. Now I was standing straight, even if my knees still trembled a little. A few days later, I did something I hadn't done in years. I visited my mother. She opened the door and gasped when she saw me. "You look different," she said, and I could tell she didn't mean my body, she meant my eyes. We sat on her porch for hours, drinking tea, and for the first time I told her everything. Every cruel comment, every time he'd made me feel unworthy, every time I'd cried in the shower so he wouldn't hear me. My mother's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't interrupt. When I finished, she took my hands and said, "You can forgive him someday if you want, but don't you dare forget what this pain taught you." That night, I went home and opened my phone. My fingers hesitated over the gallery app. There it was, a folder full of photos from the early days of our marriage. Smiles, vacations, love that once felt real. I stared at one picture where he was holding me, his arms wrapped around me, both of us laughing at something off camera. I looked so happy, so unaware of the future. I deleted the entire folder, and it didn't hurt, not the way I thought it would. Days turned into weeks, and the silence between us grew colder. One morning, as he got ready for work, he looked at me in the mirror and said, almost mockingly, "So what now? You think you're better than me?" I met his gaze calmly. "No," I said. "I just finally know I'm not left." He didn't say another word. That day, I took another small step. I applied for a job. I hadn't worked in years, always convinced that my worth was in keeping the house clean and him happy. But as I sat in that interview, talking about the things I'd forgotten I was good at, I felt alive again. When I got the job, I didn't tell him right away. I just came home that evening with a quiet smile and cooked myself dinner. He watched me from across the table, confused by the piece I wore like armor. "What's gotten into you?" he asked finally. I looked at him, my voice steady. "Freedom," I said. He laughed, but it was nervous this time. Unsure, because deep down he could feel it too. His control over me was slipping away, like sand through his fingers. And as I sat there, savoring my meal, I realized the most powerful revenge isn't anger, it's indifference. The first morning I left for my new job, he didn't even look up from his phone. That used to bother me, his silence, his lack of interest. But this time, it didn't. I walked past him, heels clicking against the floor like tiny declarations of independence. Outside, the air felt different, cooler, freer. The world wasn't waiting for me. It had always been there. I was the one who'd stopped showing up. At work, I found myself surrounded by people who didn't know my story, didn't see me through the lens of his cruelty. They saw me, the way I listened, the way I helped, the way I smiled when I spoke. My confidence was shaky at first, but every good job and every thank you stitched a little piece of me back together. I started to dress for myself again, colors I loved, clothes that made me feel alive, not smaller. And one day, as I stood by the office window during lunch, I caught my reflection. For a moment, I saw the same woman who once stood trembling in her kitchen, pretending she hadn't heard her husband call her disgusting. But now her shoulders were back, her chin was lifted, and her eyes didn't carry shame anymore, they carried fire. When I got home that evening, he was waiting. The air was thick, tense. "You've been out a lot lately," he said, his tone low. "Working, laughing. Who's making you so happy?" I looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw it. Fear, not the loud kind, but the quiet fear of a man realizing he'd lost the power to break me. "No one," I said, "just me." He stared at me for a long time, and for once, I didn't look away. I didn't shrink. I let the silence hang until he turned and stormed off. That night, I packed a small suitcase, not because I was scared, because I was ready. I didn't slam doors or make a dramatic exit. I just wrote a note. "This house used to feel like a prison. I'm setting myself free. Don't look for me. I'm not lost anymore." I left the key on the kitchen table, next to the same spot where I'd once stood shaking over a plate of pasta. I walked out into the early dawn, the world still quiet, the air tasting like promise. The first few weeks on my own were hard. There were nights I cried, mornings I doubted myself, moments I wanted to run back, not because I missed him, but because I missed who I used to be before life wore me down. But healing isn't neat, it's messy, uneven, full of steps forward and backward. Still, each sunrise reminded me why I left. One evening, a few months later, I found myself sitting at a cafe, sipping coffee and laughing with a few new friends. Someone cracked a joke, and I laughed so hard my stomach hurt. That's when I realized I hadn't laughed like that in years, not the polite kind, the real, full-bodied, unstoppable kind. And as I wiped a tear from my cheek, I whispered to myself, "You see, you're still capable of joy." That night, I walked home through the city lights, feeling something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Peace, real, deep, grounding peace. And then, one day, he called. His number flashing on my screen made my heart jolt. but not from love, from memory. I hesitated, then answered, "Hello?" He was quiet for a moment before speaking. "You look happy," he said softly. "I saw your picture on social media." "I am," I replied. He sighed. "You've lost weight." I smiled faintly. "No," I said, "I've lost you." Silence, then a quiet click as he hung up. I put my phone down and exhaled, a single tear rolling down, not from sadness, but relief, because I finally understood. The woman he once tried to break no longer existed. She had outgrown his cruelty. She had found her worth. She had rebuilt herself from every insult he ever threw. And now, she was unstoppable. Months passed, and life began to bloom in colors I had forgotten existed. I rented a small apartment, not fancy, but filled with light. The walls were bare at first, but slowly, they began to tell my story. A potted plant here, a painting there, photos of new memories, taped beside the mirror. Every corner whispered freedom. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit on my balcony with a cup of tea, listening to the hum of the city below. There was no one to tell me how to dress, what to eat, or what I should look like. The silence that once suffocated me now felt sacred. One evening, I got a message from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but curiosity won. "I hope you're doing well," it said. It was him, my husband, or rather the man who used to be my husband. He didn't know I had already filed for divorce a month after leaving. For a moment, my heart felt heavy, not with love, but with the memories of who I had been when I loved him. I typed back slowly, I hope someday you learn to see people for their hearts, not their sizes." He didn't reply. In that silence was all the closure I needed. As time went on, I began speaking up more at work, in conversations, even to strangers. People started to notice. One day, my manager invited me to share a few words at a women's seminar the company was hosting. My first instinct was fear. Who was I to stand before anyone and talk about strength? But then I thought of that night, his words echoing in the kitchen, and I knew I had to. When I took the stage that day, my hands trembled, but my voice did. I told them the truth, not the polished, comfortable version, but the raw one. I told them about the woman who smiled while dying inside, the woman who stayed silent for love, the woman who mistook endurance for loyalty. And then, I told them about the morning she decided to rise. As I spoke, I saw tears in the audience, some women nodding, some holding their breath, and when I finished, they stood, not for me, but for every woman who had ever believed she wasn't enough. Afterward, a young girl approached me. She was shaking, eyes glistening. "Your story," she whispered. "It's my story too." I hugged her tightly, and in that moment, I realized my pain hadn't been in vain. It had a purpose. It had become a light for someone else still trapped in the dark. That night, as I walked home, I stopped by a shop window and caught my reflection again. My hair was wind-touzled, my makeup faded, my body still soft and imperfect. But when I looked at myself, all I saw was beautiful, because beauty isn't in the symmetry of your face, or the size of your waist. It's in your strength, your courage, your ability to rebuild yourself when everything falls apart. And as the city lights shimmered behind me, I whispered one last time, not to him, but to the woman I once was. You survived, you healed, and you became everything they said you could. A year passed, after the seminar, and life had settled into something gentle, something real. I no longer woke up with dread, sitting heavy in my chest. I woke up to the sound of my alarm, sunlight slipping through my curtains, and the quiet hum of my own peace. Work was thriving, friendships were growing, and my laughter, oh my laughter, had returned like music I'd forgotten I loved. But healing isn't a straight line, and sometimes, late at night, I'd still hear his voice in my head. "That fat woman disgusts me." And though it no longer broke me, it still lingered like a faint scar, reminding me of a life I had outgrown, but not completely forgotten. One Saturday, my best friend Layla dragged me to an art exhibit downtown. "You've spent enough time saving yourself," she said. "Now it's time to start living again." The gallery was alive with color, canvases exploding with emotion, people murmuring softly as they sipped wine. I was standing before a painting of a woman, full-figured, radiant, her eyes fierce and proud, when a voice behind me said, "That one's my favorite too." I turned, and there he was, not him, not the man I left, but someone new. He had kind eyes, the kind that didn't wander or judge, and a smile that felt like calm instead of danger. His name was Amir. We talked for hours about art, about music, about how life sometimes breaks you, just to rebuild you into someone stronger. He didn't flirt. He listened, and when I laughed, really laughed, he looked at me like he was seeing something rare and precious. Still, I was cautious. When he asked for my number, I hesitated. "I'm not sure I'm ready," I said honestly. He nodded gently. "That's okay, I can wait until you." It wasn't love at first sight. It was respect at first conversation. Over the next few weeks, we saw each other often: coffee shops, book fairs, long walks by the beach. He never asked about my past, but one evening, I told him about the man I used to love, the words that used to crush me, the nights I thought I'd never find myself again. He didn't interrupt, he didn't pity me, he just reached across the table, took my hand and said, "Whoever said that to you was blind." Because I see someone extraordinary sitting in front of me. That moment, something inside me softened, not because I needed his validation, but because I realized I could accept love again this time, the kind that didn't come with fear. But just when I thought my story had turned the final page, life reminded me that healing isn't just about walking away, it's about staying strong when the past tries to pull you back. A few months later, I received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was familiar. It was from the man who once told me I disgusted him. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a short note, written in shaky ink. "I'm sorry, I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know I was wrong." I stared at it for a long time. The old me would have cried. The new me simply folded it, placed it in a drawer, and whispered, "I forgive you, but that doesn't mean you get to come back." That night, I went for a walk with Amir. The wind was cool, the sky a deep velvet blue. As we walked, he said softly, "You look peaceful." I smiled. And in that moment, I realized, peace isn't found when someone apologizes, it's found when you no longer need them to. Amir and I grew slowly, like dawn, easing into morning. No rush, no pressure, just light finding its way in. He didn't try to fix me, and I didn't pretend to be whole. We simply existed together in truth, both aware that love, real love, isn't loud or demanding, it's patient, it's gentle. We began spending more time together on weekends, visiting old bookstores, cooking dinner at his small apartment, sometimes sitting in silence with nothing but music playing softly. He was the kind of man who noticed the small things, the way my voice softened when I spoke about art, the way I hummed when I cooked, the way I still hesitated before accepting compliment. One evening, as I was stirring soup in his kitchen, he came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. My body tensed for a second, a reflex I still couldn't control, but then I heard his voice. "You're safe," he whispered. "With me, you're always safe." And that's when I knew, healing wasn't just about building walls, it was about learning when to let them fall. Months turned into a year, and one day, as we walked through a park, covered in autumn leaves, Amir stopped suddenly. He turned to me and said, "You know, I used to think love was about finding the perfect person, but then I met you, and I realized, it's about finding someone who makes you feel perfectly yourself." I laughed softly. "So what are you saying?" He smiled. "I'm saying, I love." The words landed differently than they ever had before, not as a chain, but as freedom. I looked at him, at the kindness in his eyes, at the man who saw my soul before he ever saw my body, and I said, "I love you too." That night, I sat on my balcony again, the same one I used to sit on alone, watching the same city lights, but this time, I wasn't lonely, I was content. And there's a difference. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who stood in that kitchen, hearing those cruel words, thinking her life was over. If only she could see herself now, not perfect, not unscarred, but free. Months later, Amir and I moved in together. It wasn't a fairy tale. We had our arguments, our misunderstandings, our moments of silence, but there was always respect, always warmth. And whenever I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the broken woman anymore. I saw someone who had learned to love without losing herself. One evening, while cleaning an old box, I found the letter from my ex-husband again. I held it for a moment, then took it to the balcony and let the wind carry it away. Watching it drift into the night, I whispered, "Thank you, because of you I met me." A few years later, Amir proposed, not with a grand gesture, or a crowd watching, but in the simplest, most beautiful way. We were walking along the beach at sunset, the waves kissing our feet, when he stopped, held my hand and said, "I don't want to change your life, I just want to walk beside you for the rest of it." And for the first time I said yes, not because I was afraid to be alone, but because I was already complete, and love was no longer my escape, it was my choice. That night, as we stood under a sky full of stars, I realized something I'd been searching for all along. Sometimes pain is the storm that washes you clean, and when the skies finally clear, you see yourself stronger, softer, wiser than before. Because the truth is, I was never the fat woman who disgusted him, I was the woman who survived him, and that, I think, is the most beautiful ending any story could have. Years later, I stood before a mirror once more, this time dressed in ivory silk, my hair soft around my face, a faint tremor in my hands, not from fear, but from the weight of everything this moment meant. It wasn't a grand wedding, just a small gathering on the beach, the same place where Amir had proposed. The waves rolled in steady rhythm, the sky painted in gold and blush. My friends, my mother and a few people who had become family stood waiting. When I stepped onto the sand, barefoot, the wind caught my veil, lifting it slightly like a whisper of blessing. I looked ahead, and there he was, Amir, standing under an arch of white flowers, his eyes fixed on me as if the rest of the world had disappeared. Every step I took felt like walking through time, past the nights I cried myself to sleep, past the mornings I doubted my worth, past every cruel word that tried to convince me I wasn't enough. And as I reached him, I realized I hadn't walked toward a man, I'd walked toward peace. When it was time to speak our vows, Amir held my hands, his voice steady and warm. "I don't promise to make life perfect," he said, "but I promise to stand beside you when it isn't. You don't need to be more or less of anything for me to love you. You just need to be you, and that's more than enough." The tears came then, quiet, unashamed, full of gratitude. When it was my turn, I took a deep breath and said, "I once thought love was something you had to earn by shrinking yourself, by staying silent. But you've shown me that real love doesn't ask you to disappear, it asks you to stay exactly as you are." The guests clapped softly, the sea breeze carrying their laughter. When we kissed, the world felt still, as if every broken piece of my past had finally found its place. Later, as the sun dipped low and music played softly in the distance, I wandered away from the crowd for a moment. The ocean stretched before me, endless and alive. I closed my eyes and whispered, "You did it," not to Amir, not to anyone around me, but to her, the woman who once stood trembling in her kitchen, pretending she hadn't heard those words. And in that moment, I imagined her beside me, older now, wiser, smiling through tears. "You didn't just survive," she'd say, "you learned to." Years passed again, and life moved gently forward. Amir and I built a home filled with laughter, warmth, and respect. One evening, as I sat with our daughter, she asked me, "Mama, were you always this strong?" I smiled. "No," I said softly, "but I learned to be." She tilted her head. "How?" I looked out the window, watching the sky fade into twilight, "Because once, someone tried to make me believe I wasn't enough, and instead of breaking, I decided to prove to myself that I." As she leaned against me, I felt a quiet pride fill the room, not for what I had endured, but for what I had become. That night, after tucking her into bed, I stood by the window again, the moonlight soft on my face, and I realized, the story that began with cruelty had ended with compassion. The words that once crushed me had built a stronger voice, and the love I thought I'd lost forever had found its way back, in a purer, gentler form. Because healing isn't forgetting the pain, it's looking at your scars and saying, "You didn't." And sometimes the most powerful revenge is happiness that no one can take away. Years later, decades really, I found myself sitting on that same old balcony, the one that had witnessed every version of me. My hair had silvered by now, my hands carried the soft wrinkles of time, and my heart was quiet, not because it was empty, but because it was finally at peace. Amir was inside. Our daughter had grown up, and moved to another city, chasing her own dreams, carrying a fire that reminded me so much of the woman I once fought to become. And in that stillness, with the night air brushing against my skin, I decided to write something, not a diary, not a confession, but a letter to the woman I used to be. Dear me, I remember you, the night you stood in the kitchen, frozen, your heart breaking quietly while he laughed. I remember the way your fingers shook, the way you smiled to hide the hurt, the way you convinced yourself that love was supposed to feel like pain. You didn't know it then, but that was the moment everything began to change. You thought his words defined you. You thought fat meant unlovable, that disgusting meant undeserving. But my love, you were wrong. Those words didn't define you, they revealed him. And someday, you would look back and realize that his cruelty was the storm that watered your roots. You would rebuild. You would walk away trembling but unbroken. You would learn that silence is not peace, and that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, it means freeing yourself. You would find love again, the kind that doesn't ask you to shrink, the kind that doesn't come from someone else's eyes, but from your own reflection. And one day, you would stand before a crowd of women, each one carrying their own story of pain, and you would speak. Your voice, once choked by fear, would flow like a river, and they would listen, because you would be speaking their hearts aloud. You would tell them that no insult, no scar, no betrayal can decide their worth, only they can. You will live a long, beautiful life. You'll laugh again, you'll dance barefoot in your kitchen, you'll grow old beside a man who never tries to silence your light. And when you look in the mirror one last time, you won't see what he saw, you'll see what you fought for.